possible. Then how do we store date values? How do we store the date values? So important is in order to store date value in memory in order to store date value in memory, so you have to define you have to initialize date type memory. You have to initialize date type memory by using date constructor. We generally call this date constructor. In order to store date value in memory, you have to initialize date type memory. In order to store a date value, you have to initialize date type memory. Means you need to design, allocate memory in such a way that you have to allocate memory such a way that you can store date values into them. And how we can allocate date type memory? By using the constructor date constructor. That means how to define. So let some date value, its data type is any, is equal to, we need to allocate memory, then new is a memory allocating operator, new date. That's how we have to define. That is how we have to define date value into memory, date type of memory. So that means how we can handle dates, because in all applications dealing with the date is very common. Regularly you will see this. Every day you need to work with date values. Any application you are developing for client, so it requires a lot of manipulations with the dates. So in that case, we need to know how to handle the dates perfectly. So there is no specific data type. So we use any type. Then how to store date value into the any type memory? So we have to first initialize the memory for date type. That means how do we initialize the memory? Is we need to initialize the memory as new date. That's how we initialize the memory. Now, when you initialize the memory like this, what happens is, so when you do this by default, so by default, it loads the current date. It loads the current date into memory. By default, it loads the current date into memory. That means whatever the current system date is there, it loads the date into memory. If you want to define any specific date, so that means if you want to initialize or store any date. So if you want to initialize or store any specific date, you have then you have to pass the date value into constructor, in a string format, and that format should be year, so YY, so MM and DD, like this. It should be entered in this format. Year, month, day. It matters, and it is strictly year, month, day only. So whenever you are dealing with the dates in JavaScript or TypeScript, you should know that this is the only way of handling the dates. That means this is the only way of storing the date and dealing with the date. That means we need to configure the date. Actually, what happens, this will store the current date. This will store the current date. Let's print that and see. That means console.log. I am printing that manufactured. Suppose I said here backtick. I'm just writing here only manufactured I want to print. Suppose I want to print the name. Name is equal to, it is name variable. And in the next line, I want to print manufactured. And manufactured is coming from manufactured. Okay. Then I will save this. Only those two details we are printing. And let's open this. So we created a separate date type. Yeah, here tsc demo.ts and node demo.js. And you can see it prints the manufactured in a correct date format. And you can see it prints the current date correctly. So by default, it is going to store the date value and it will store the current date. If you want to store any specific date, then what you have to do is you have to pass the date value into the date constructor. That means syntax. You need to define let date value. So it is any type is equal to new date. And here you have to pass in a string format with year, month, day format. Year, month, day format. That means 2020 and month 03, then 20, like this. That's how we can pass the value. So that means the date values must be passed into the date constructor in a string form. Directly, you cannot store a string form. That means let date value and any type is equal to, if I write 2020 and 03 and 20. So this is a string, not a date. So that is important. If it is not a date, you cannot manipulate. You cannot know which month it is. We cannot know which year it is. It is just like a string type. Now here, so we are passing the value. That means in the date constructor, we can pass the value like this. So 2020 and 03 and 20. That's how we need to pass the value. If I'm passing the value like this, suppose I said like 2003 and 2020. That is the format I am using here. And I will compile that. Value. And I will run this. And you see here invalid date. It prints invalid date. That means the format is very important. You have to follow the format. So date cannot be in this format. It should be written in a string. In a string, the format should be year, month, day. That means now the date value must be stored in the format like this. That means 2020. So month 0320, like this. And I saved this and I compile this again now. And this time the date that you have stored will be printed. And this is Friday, March 20, 2020. And the sum time, by default, it picks up the time. How to print a date in a correct format, I will tell you. But how to store the dates, that we need to know that first. So this is how we can store a date value into the memory. And we need to know that there are certain rules to follow. You cannot simply do that, right? That means this is initializing. declaring and rendering also can be done.